TVRain, Дождь. The only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that?
There will be very serious consequences.
TVRain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
4 Russian-occupied regions in southern and eastern Ukraine showed almost North Korean levels of electoral support this week in a sham referendum held during wartime, with results that overwhelmingly agreed to accept annexation by Russia. From 97 to 99% in favor, depending on the region. It looks like no one in Moscow is trying to pretend it's serious. Hi, I'm Ekaterina Kotrikadze. This is TVRain, and you are watching Russia Tomorrow. And in today's program, Pseudoreferendums in southeastern Ukraine set the stage for annexation by Russia. Why does Putin continue to insist on the fig leaf of electoral legitimacy for this invasion of a sovereign country? Chaos and fear for millions of men in Russia continue to grow. How successful is the so-called partial mobilization in seeking out hundreds of thousands of reservists for the war in Ukraine? Plane tickets from Russia to visa-friendly countries are all sold out. Thousands cross into Georgia, Kazakhstan and even Mongolia on foot, and the West closes its transit visa regime to Russians in Europe. Votes to join the Russian Federation were conducted on Ukrainian territory this week in sham referendums staged by an occupying force during wartime. 4 Russian-occupied provinces of southern and eastern Ukraine showed almost North Korean levels of electoral support in results that overwhelmingly agreed to accept annexation by Russia. In Kherson, Russians reported 87% of the votes in support of annexation. In Zaporozhye, 93%, while the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk clocked in at a truly unbelievable 98 and 99%, respectively. To some, it looks like a present for the Russian president's birthday. He is turning 70 on October 7th. Big jubilee. Everyone around him knows that he is expecting something solid as a gift. Russian Senator Andrei Klishas wrote on his Telegram page that in order to fulfill the will of the voters, constitutional changes will be needed for Russian Federation that would allow the annexation of new federal territories. Where these constitutional reforms will come from, what they will contain and whom they will affect are all brand new questions that only cast more doubt on the legitimacy of the vote. Still, Ukrainian officials, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, say the illegal annexation of their territories has no material effect on their military actions and that the counteroffensive begun earlier this month will continue with no change. Zelensky, speaking at the UN Security Council, also warned that if Moscow attacks Ukrainian lands, there will be no negotiations. According to Zelensky, Russia is not a reliable partner. It directly threatens the world with its nuclear weapons, and it should be disarmed.
In front of the eyes of the whole world, Russia is conducting this so-called sham referenda on the occupied territory of Ukraine. People are forced to fill out some papers while being threatened by submachine guns, all for a nice TV cover. These alleged results of the sham referenda have been prepared well in advance, just as this compulsory issue of passports for the population of the occupied territories.
I would like to remind everyone that our country also possesses various means of destruction that are even more modern than those of NATO countries. In the case of a threat to our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we will not hesitate to use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people.
Putin insists that nuclear weapons are not a bluff, but the stakes are too high for the survival of the country he leads. And the bluff, according to political scientist Volodymyr Fesenko, makes no sense other than to put pressure on hypothetically fearful Western partners.
So far, these statements about a nuclear attack in the case of a continued Ukrainian counteroffensive are more of a threat to intimidate the West, to pressure Kyiv into negotiations towards at least a ceasefire. Essentially, to preserve and solidify the current status quo. But I believe Putin's plan is quite different. Mobilization is not happening to facilitate a nuclear strike. Of course, everyone is terrified of nuclear weapons, but if we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, their effect would be limited. Because it's just an intimidation attempt, really. It would not have a fundamental impact on the course of military operations within Ukraine, but it would move the war into a completely uncompromising terminal stage. All restrictions and limitations would be lifted for Ukraine, and the war would inevitably move into Russian territory. Now, Ukrainian troops do not cross the border on principle, but there would then be no deterring factors for this. I also think that the West would then provide all and any possible weapons to Ukraine so that they could retaliate, and the war would become all-encompassing and fatal. Apart from global nuclear war, this is the riskiest scenario. Russia tomorrow.
Draft mobilization continues across the country this week, and thousands of men have already reported for duty at training centers and military offices throughout Russia. But civilian protests started first, and in more than 50 cities, protesters in group, large and small, took to the streets to voice their disapproval of the mobilization. In total, more than 2,400 people were detained by police during the demonstrations. Still, Kremlin officials and the Russian government say they are on track to fill quotas for recruits from every region of the country in a mobilization of the military's active and ready reservists that they insist is only partial. Discussing Putin's partial mobilization and the protests in Russian regions, we're now joined by Dmiry Bykov, prominent Russian writer, journalist, and a poet. Dmitry, hello.
Nice to meet you, Kate. Fine to meet you, everybody.
Yes, nice to see you here. And speaking in English with you is something different and new for us, but I hope that it's going to be all right for both of us. So first thing I wanted to ask you about is the level of this protest in Russia. How serious is this? Can it change anything, in your opinion?
You know, the only sign of serious protest is coming to the side of protestants from some representatives of the so-called Siloviks, ministers of suppression, of some repressive ministers. If they understand that the protest is really serious, some of them begin to change their mind very quickly. This process is avalanche-like. And like for example, in Georgia, like it happened at the Shevardnadze, or in Ukraine, like it happened in the last days of Yanukovych's power, when the first representatives of the so-called Russian police will go to the side of protestants, to the side of Navalnyists, for example, so we'll see that something serious is really happening. I think it will take 2 or 3 months.
2 or 3 months. Why so? Why is this 2 or 3 months period of time important?
Well, you see, Kate, it's really very funny to read all those predictions about long way to the crash of Putin's regime. We all know that in some situations the process is really very quickly, goes really very quickly. It is quick because self-destruction of regime, of all its institutions and all its representatives, of all its influencers, really goes non-stop. You know, for example, for recent 10 years, they were destroying their regime in a slow manner, I should say in a soft manner, but the logic of regime is much more powerful than, for example, Putin's will for self-keeping. His instinct of self-keeping is away now, because, you know, the logic of regime demands the outer war. They can't live without the hot war. That's the only foundation for the consolidation of society. Maybe they really had no exit. You know, Putin is always repeating that he had no exit, that he hadn't left any other way, any way out. Maybe that's so, but he is wrong because he says he is surrounded by collective West. West is not guilty. That's the logic of time, the logic of his governing. His time is over. Elderness, just getting old, getting ill, getting insane, because 23 years on such a throne, it makes you sometimes really crazy. You don't see the limits of your power and the limits of your electoral time. This all means that he's really surrounded by enemies, but his main enemies are the new generation, the future, the time itself, the death itself, and so on. So his war is just a desperate attempt to avoid unavoidable. And maybe that's the logic of his self-destruction. Sergei Medvedev, who is one of our best historians of modernity, I should say, wrote in his recent column that there were 3 fatal mistakes, and they were really very quick, one quicker than another. The first one was war, then embargo on Russian oil, and the third, which was also unavoidable, the mobilization. After it, the events will go really quickly.
Okay, when you talk about the mobilization, Dmitry, well, maybe he is insane. We don't know that precisely, but still, we can imagine that they, in Kremlin, they did have a plan. They understood beforehand that there would be some kind of protests in Russian regions, in Russian cities, so they might be ready for that. Do you think that the level of repressions will grow? I understand that it's really high already, but still something more.
Oh, you ask as if their forces were endless, but they're limited, and very soon they'll understand it. You know, even now, they demand maybe actually a million of new troopers, new ordinary soldiers, just maybe to fight in Kherson, to fight under Kharkiv. I'm not sure in which direction they will be used, but however, they need millions of new troopers. I think that very soon they'll have the strong necessity to take most of policemen or the so-called OMON, as we decided, the special troops of Russian police. They'll have to take them to real military business, not only to beat the protesters. Maybe very soon they'll understand that their force is really very limited. Maybe the hole in their defense will be bigger and bigger. And maybe, I'm not sure, but I hope so, some of them, even now, begin to understand that regime will use them without any conscience. There is no limits, for example, for Putin's crime. He really has no exit. He can do his situation only worse. And very soon, with every step, it begins worse. So I think that maybe in 3 months, they'll understand that there will be no other way for them except beginning protesting. Maybe, you know, the protests of those policemen would be the beginning of real Russian reconstruction or revolution or whatever you call it. You know, because, for example, I remember very well the second half of 80s when militia just refused to beat demonstrants and to appear on meetings because there were more than millions of people on Moscow streets. I remember Manezhnaya Ploshchad, Manezhnaya Square at that time. It was really very conclusive for them, very conclusive and very evident. I think that 3 months is quite enough to understand that Putin is lonesome. He has no support.
Final thing I would like to ask you about, let's imagine this happens, what you predict, and Putin falls. Does this mean that democracy comes to Russia? Does this mean that me and you and others will go back home?
Well, I'll be back anyhow, because I promised to organize the New Year celebration in the studios of Echo of Moscow. I'm not sure that Benedictov will take back the studio on November, but because Margarita Simonyan and her studio Sputnik was there for nearly a year, and I think that we need the priest just to take away all the demons of her governing. But nevertheless, maybe saint water, maybe something more, maybe prayers. But nevertheless, we'll be back. You know, all those doubts about Putin's system, which will stay after him, which will survive him, that's an illusion. Maybe we'll get in Russia sometimes the new wave of resentment and new fascism, comparing, for example, with German situation of the 30s, maybe now we have 20s and we do. But nevertheless, the first time after Putin will be a sight of freedom. That would be the wind of changes, because everybody is so tired of aggression, of cruelty, of unfair, of the absence of court and anything. I'm sure that this tiresome society will like to make maybe a short interruption in wars and repression.
Dmitry,
we all miss it greatly.
We all miss it greatly. Thank you so much, Dmitry. It was prominent Russian writer, journalist and poet Dmitry Bykov on Russia Tomorrow.
Russia Tomorrow.
Soon after mobilization was declared, the life plans for the millions of men across Russia suddenly changed. The only thing people talk about now is how and when to leave. How can you get across 2 days of overland travel to the border of Kazakhstan? How far can you get in a car? What about the train? And if you go to Belarus, would the Lukashenko regime just surrender you back to Putin? If you are lucky enough to be holding a valid Schengen visa, who will let you into Europe? How much time is left before the curtain drops and the lights go dark? On the one hand, Putin decreed a military mobilization that he calls partial, a shocking hint from the Russian president that even as he refuses to call the war in Ukraine a war, the special military operation that began 218 days ago isn't going according to plan. On the other hand, Putin is still behaving like Putin, with demonstrated self-assurance and an expanding cinematic universe of illusion and lies. His repeated use of the word partial, as logic follows, is to help convince Russian citizens that the army will only send competent, trained soldiers to the front. The Kremlin is so fearful of creating panic in Russian society, and for a good reason, that they have deployed their loyal scribes on state TV, as well as an army of bloggers and Instagram influencers, to launch a directed publicity campaign to try and soothe the frayed nerves of a fearful public. After all, it's just 1% of the eligible population being called up, they say. Just 1%. Brave Russian soldier, you are just one jelly bean in a packet full of candy.
Is one sweet a lot? This is 1% of the pack of sweets. Now, what am I talking about exactly? Today, all you hear about is mobilization. It's time to calm down, pull ourselves together, and use our common sense. Would you be satisfied with just one French fry from a whole packet? I think most people would say no. Because one French fry is just 1% of the whole portion, and that 1% isn't very much. Why am I talking about this? Your opponent is trying to get you to panic. As you might have guessed, I'm talking about mobilization. It's a difficult topic and everyone seems to have been swept up by panic and fear. Right now, we need to stay supportive and remain calm. Take a look at my photo. Can you see how small 1% of this bag is? We have spent the past couple of days in a constant state of panic. Now we take a look at the photo again and read what's written below. The situation has left no other choice, but our panic is what our enemies want.
The interesting thing about the situation is that all the jelly beans still get eaten. The even more interesting thing about the situation is that even here you are being lied to, because partial mobilization, my dear Russians, will inevitably turn, is already turning, into a general mobilization. In the places that hundreds of thousands of Russian men have flocked to, Georgia especially, these guests are not at all welcome. Imagine being welcomed by a citizen of a country 20% of which is occupied by Russian troops. Imagine just 14 years ago, and before that 30 years ago, that your neighbor's army came to your house and killed, looted, drove families with children away through the mountains in freezing temperatures and made them refugees in their own country. It's impossible to forget. Now imagine when the same army attacked another neighbor, this time Ukraine, and suddenly your cities, your streets, your restaurants are all filled up with Russians. On the one hand, you know that many of the new arrivals escaped repression and detention. But on the other hand, there are those who say they just came to buy a new iPhone, right? In your city, you hear Russian speech all around you, the speech of the occupiers. It could drive you mad. And now there is a second wave on a much larger scale. These young guys are coming into your country, those who were too lazy, it seems, to overthrow Putin before and immediately after the war began. Then were too scared to fight themselves and ran here to save their own skin. Why should we accept them? That's what the average Georgian citizen asks. And he would be partly right, of course, as far as Russian aggression and occupation are concerned. And maybe, too, about Russian society's baffling indifference. This discussion began too long before mobilization was announced. In recent months, there was endless debate about the collective responsibility of Russians. My personal position is that this conversation itself is harmful and perverse. After all, if we consider ourselves civilized people, we simply cannot forget the basic principle of a progressive society. This is not to generalize and to treat everyone as a unique individual, and therefore not to hold people responsible for the crimes of others. I understand that this cowardly Russian people might drive you crazy. They might be cowardly or devoid of empathy or education or critical thinking. They all have their excuses. But there are also those who from the very beginning understood and disagreed with everything about Putin and the war, but could not leave. One could not dare to leave his family, another could not dare to leave his job, another simply could not find the money to move. Are these people guilty? Do they now have to become cannon fodder as punishment for such a position? Do they have to follow orders and become killers? A lot of people still insist, let them fight their own Putin, then they wouldn't have to go to the military office and join the war. We've seen this discussion a long time, so I will not talk about the mass protests and repression in Russia. But let's just say they didn't do enough to fight. What law or code defines this as a crime? What could its punishment possibly consist of? Try and find a statement like, for inadequate resistance to the ruling regime, citizens of the Russian Federation will be sentenced to transportation to a combat zone, killed and returned to their homeland in a coffin in any international legal system. You wouldn't find nothing like that.
I'm facing an incredibly difficult decision. I'm a surgeon, eligible for the draft. On one hand, I can't support our fascist government's aggressive war, but on the other hand, there's a huge amount of completely innocent, brainless guys going there just as cannon fodder. Some of them will die immediately, but you can try and save some of them too. I don't want to be in the occupied territories of the devastated Ukraine, but I can't just leave.
Today, on the 23rd of September, in the Kryponovo village of the Ardatovsky district of the Nizhny Novgorod region, the police took a young man away for the draft. He had a very pregnant wife, an alcoholic father, and a mother constantly working different jobs. His young wife is starving and really struggling. His grandmother is bedridden and just returned from a second course of chemotherapy yesterday. The guy served in the army in the call-up of spring-summer 2020 and came back a year ago. He saw nothing but a poor, rural life.
These are quotes from letters written by TVRain's viewers. The war in Ukraine has changed the world. And it is not just that we're now seriously discussing the specifics of tactical nuclear strikes and the sanitary properties of iodine, but also that mass generalization has become commonplace. After what happened in Bucha and Izium, the phrase citizen of Russia carries a toxic connotation. You can now impose bans and restrictions on all Russians, even if you are a member of the European Union. But listen, there's no reason to abandon those who are against the war. What practical sense would that make? You can and must see allies in them, allies of the civilized world. The more of us we are, the stronger we become, and the weaker the aggressor finally is.
Russia tomorrow.
With insightful weekly commentary on the war in Ukraine and what this means for Russian society, here is TVRain columnist and colleague Mikhail Fishman.
It's as if there are two Vladimir Putins. The first Putin meets with leaders of Asian countries in Samarkand, outside Russia, and gives assurances to India's Prime Minister Modi and to Turkey's President Erdogan that he wants to put his war with Ukraine to an end, sooner rather than later. The second Putin returns home and dramatically escalates the war a few days later. He declares a mass, though officially limited, mobilization and an urgent annexation of the occupied territories of Ukraine. The reason behind the actions of these two Putins is the same. He is losing the criminal and bloody war he started in Ukraine 6 months ago. But the first Putin finds himself in the real world, while the second one in his fictional universe, in the Orwellian dystopia he had been building over the course of the last 22 years. And it is finally clear. He will never be able to abandon this fictional universe. For Putin, after September 21st, there is no way back to reality. On September 21st, Putin's war entered a new phase. Previously, Russians went to war by their own choice, at least officially, either as professional soldiers or as volunteers. Previously, Russians paid for their dictatorship with their well-being, with their future, and with the future of their children. Now, everything has changed. Since September 21st, the Russian government has introduced a completely new tax on Russians, their lives. A well-known children's poem from the 1920s is now going viral over Russian social media. It's the story of a cockroach who intimidated all the other animals, became their leader, and gave them the following order.
You animals, why don't you bring me your babies? I'll eat them for supper tonight.
To sweep his defeat in this war under the rug, Putin is sending hundreds of thousands of Russians to his war. The Defense Ministry claims it's a limited mobilization. Only those who have already served in the army and have combat experience will be drafted. But in reality, anyone and everyone is being called up and sent straight to the battlefield. In Moscow, city famous for its cultural and social life, for its comfortable infrastructure, mobilization centers are being opened in museums and theaters, according to the authorities, for the convenience of Moscow residents.
Temporary mobilization points will open in Moscow for the convenience of residents. The creation of temporary mobilization points will help ensure comfortable conditions both for the mobilized and for those who live in the immediate vicinity of the active military registration and enlistment officers. Also, for the convenience of mobilized people, transport will be organized from the buildings of the military registration and enlistment officers to the temporary mobilization points.
Russia is turning into a dystopia before our eyes, as the publication Medusa puts it. In the 21st century, Stalinism is returning to a nation of smartphones and the internet, to cities of electric scooters and car sharing, to a modern Russia of burger joints, coffee shops and gourmet restaurants. Political scientists and journalists, myself included, have long compared today's Russia to Stalin's. Putin uses the same rhetoric and the same slogans. But there have always been valid objections to this analogy. Stalin's rule was built on mass repression, total violence, and omnipresent fear. Everyone had a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a workmate who had been repressed by the state. The entire nation was terrorized. Life was built on the single goal: survival. In Putin's Russia, it was not the case. Dissidents and activists are in jail. Yet the order is based on depoliticization and demobilization. But now, massive repression has finally come to Russia. A knock on the door at 6 a.m., a police officer and 2 agents at the entrance. You have 30 minutes to pack your stuff. In Russia, this is reality once again. Human lives have once again become state property. In villages, the people are rounded up, and there are reported cases of all or almost all men taken away for mobilization. 80 or 90 years ago, they were sent to camps or executed. Today, they are sent straight to the battlefield. Stalin locked farmers and their families in kolkhoz, Soviet collective farms. Collectivization was his answer to the grain supply crisis that his economy was grappling with. With mobilization, Putin is responding to his own crisis, the defeat of his military. Just as they did in the times of the Great Purge, the authorities are sending out orders of how many people they need, back then for execution as enemies of the state, and now to send them to their deaths in Ukraine. Here are the benchmark figures for several regions, according to journalists and local authorities.
Dagestan, 3 million inhabitants, 15,000 men. Nizhny Novgorod region, 3 million inhabitants, 7,500 men. Buryatia, 1 million inhabitants, 5,000 men. Yekaterinburg region, 4.2 million inhabitants, 9,700 men. Moscow, 12 million inhabitants, 16,000 men.
once again, people turn into numbers on paper. The Ministry of Defense claims that 300,000 people will be drafted as part of the limited mobilization, but Putin's decree simply omits the total number. The decree's 6th paragraph is followed immediately by the 8th, while the 7th paragraph is completely hidden from publication, just as Stalin did not publish his execution lists. But unlike Stalin's time, Putin's mobilization has shown that there are in fact two Russias. In one Russia, people agree to live in Putin's fictional world, the dystopia that he has built. And they are ready to go to war. If it has to be done, they and their families say, then it has to be done. They obediently pack their bags when drafted and say, those at the top know better. But the other Russia is fleeing. Hundreds of thousands of people have left in a matter of days. Hundreds of thousands more are still gathering at the borders of neighboring countries. Kazakhstan has become the main refuge, with its border with Russia expanding over 7,000 kilometers. It has been already reported that since September 21st, 100,000 Russians entered the country in less than a week. Thousands of people are stuck at the border with Georgia. Thousands are fleeing to Mongolia. On the 5th day, protests against mobilization broke out in different corners of Russia: Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, Yakutia. State propaganda already acknowledges that the implementation of mobilization is going on with mistakes and calls to correct them. But this does not mean that the government is backing off. Stalin too spoke of occasional overzealousness when the farmers rebelled in response to collectivization. Having announced mobilization, Putin moved to a fundamentally different relationship with the nation. Now it does not matter what his approval rating is. Now, like under Stalin, his power is based on total violence and fear. However, the developments after September 21st have shown that Putin does not control all of Russia. The reality has found its way into Putin's universe, isolated from the world by propaganda and repression. And sooner rather than later, it will destroy it.
Russia Tomorrow.
Thank you for watching Russia Tomorrow. I am Ekaterina Kotrikadze. Share your subscription to our YouTube channel with friends and show them you support us on GoFundMe. The link is in the description. See you soon.